Welcome, everybody. This is a special seminar as part of the NRF CPT, that is Collaborative Postgraduate Training Project, that lasted from 2017 to 2019, but is ongoing, unfunded though, at the moment. And Temba Middlemann is our first graduate from that PhD graduate. So Doctor Temba Middlemann is the first PhD graduate from that program, and he will be presenting today. Just a few words. Most of the audience are actually project participants, but just for those that aren't, just a few words about the project. So this call for CPT applications to the CPT program in the NRF led a team together. It was a Durban University of Technology's Urban Future Center, University of Venda, Department of Urban and Regional Planning, and CUBES at the School of Architecture and Planning at Wits University. So we compiled this team and decided that between us we had the capacity to supervise 7 or 8 PhD students across our institutions. And the theme we gave it was urban resilience and spatial justice, and that really being a driving theme that brought us together, that we're all very passionate about. And we had a fantastic response with 7 very strong PhD students who are either, Temba's the first of them to have completed, the others are busy writing up. And so this is a real celebration for our project today. So Temba will be presenting on potential beginnings of public space in South Africa, critical interactions between spatial justice and public space in the inner city of Johannesburg. And I'll quickly introduce Temba. He was born in Johannesburg, and his undergraduate studies at Wits University cemented his love for history and skepticism for economics, always working on art in his free time. His passion for and training in history continued with an honors in history, also at Wits, which involved a narrower focus on South and Southern African history, a master's degree in African studies at Oxford University, broadened his appreciation of history's broader sweeps, as well as refining his research interests around South African public history and memory, focusing on Constitutional Hill in Johannesburg. So master's fieldwork at Constitution Hill had already inspired a growing interest in the ways public spaces are used, especially when explored in relation to their history, management, and perceptions. Then, after hearing of an NRF-funded collaborative PhD bursary on the theme of spatial justice and urban resilience, his interest in public space gained focus, forming the basis of his investigation into public space and spatial justice. His research involved expanding from Constitution Hill to compare it with other types of public space. As he navigated the examination of his PhD thesis this year, Temba stayed at the Wits School of Architecture and Planning and in CUBES and started a postdoc there. And the postdoc was funded through the Life in the City program. And I'd just like to add that I think Temba will agree, highlights in his PhD journey were the 3 workshops that we managed to organize through this project, one at Wits and one in Durban and one in Thohoyandou at University of Venda. So for all of us, I think those were the highlights and what really formed the basis of our collaborative work. So in the absence of the possibility of meeting face-to-face, we now have this possibility online. So it's great to have brought everyone together. And over to you, Temba.
Thanks very much, Marie. And thank you all very much for
Can I just
joining
ask
us.
everyone else to mute themselves? I see a few people are unmuted.
So I'll continue, assuming that you can all see the screen and things. It's great to reconnect with you guys and be in as close to what we can call a room as possible at these days. And yeah, I'm happy to be able to share some of my work on the thesis with all of you and kind of catch up, as well as try and share my findings. So the title I ended up with was The Interactions Between Public Spaces and Spatial Injustice, Comparing Case Studies from Inner City Johannesburg. In terms of the structure of the presentation, I'm going to sort of start on some of the theoretical components, looking at public space and justice as sort of the driving concepts in the conceptual framework. I'm going to just touch quickly on methods and some of the case study selections. Then I'll go through some of what I thought were the core tensions and sticking points and potentials at the three main case studies, Gandhi Square, Constitution Hill, and Peter Rose Park. Then I'm going to speak a little bit about the walking route that I walked that connects these three spaces, to try and discuss a few points around public space in terms of networks, connections, and fragmentation. And then gladly there's a few students here, and so hopefully it'll be useful to share some points from my own journey and some of the challenges in finishing such a thing. And hopefully we can discuss some of that afterwards. So I guess as I presented in our last workshop, one of the initial starting points for the conceptual framework was using Lefebvre's spatial triad to try and gain a deeper understanding of the processes that produce space. And this connects quite well with his concept of the right to the city. And I kind of, increasingly as I worked into these bodies of literature, kind of coming to think about the more public a space is, the more it tends towards justice and spatial justice. And when publicness is reduced or undermined, the more it tends towards spatial injustice. I also tried to look at how the importance of perception and culture are in understanding public space and the way that we understand it and use it. And I used public culture as a way to articulate some of the drivers and causes, as well as implications of different actions and behaviors and understandings in and of public space. Some of the key things were to do with management and use, belonging and exclusion, some of these kind of dialectical relationships. And I found Lefebvre's spatial triad quite helpful in some of these, looking at how management practices could correspond with Lefebvre's ideas of representations of space, or conceptions of space, whereas use, which comprises spatial practice, can either tend towards dominated space when spatial practice is in line with those representations and plans of space, or towards representational spaces in which users are able to develop new meanings and produce difference outside of state power. And some of how those things play out determine key issues for spatial justice of belonging and exclusion. In some ways, it presents some paradoxes because public space is such a cross-cutting issue in urban studies. And some of the interactions between public space and spatial justice are so multi-leveled that they do occasionally bring up some paradoxes and contradictions. And one final piece was about the importance of seeing public space and spatial justice as processes and potentials rather than fixed events or outcomes. Following Soja's critical spatial perspective towards justice, and Adegaya and Kutsia in a useful article that frames relevant concepts of spatial justice in a global South context, look at some of these principles that are listed there, which a lot of the theories on spatial justice use these principles in some way or another. And I think very interestingly here, given the levels and scales of marginality and inequality, this idea of benefit to the disadvantaged is a very interesting and compelling, but also difficult idea. A lot of it boils down in various ways to access, whether it's on a small level of direct access to physical public places, or on a broader level in terms of the makeup of the city and what kind of public space people have access to in general. And I think just noting that in South Africa, spatial justice is still quite elusive theoretically and practically, and so it's a lot about understanding spatial injustice better and seeing how are we responding to this and how are we attempting to undo this. So in terms of the theory on public space and how it coalesces with ideas of justice, public space is often seen as some kind of expression of the structure and culture of society. There's some important ideas around openness and access, which are sort of seen as foundational values for public space. And then there's this idea of order, where whatever vision one might have for public space, whether it's a highly controlled space or a space that's ordered in the sense of people behaving according to acceptable behaviors, this idea of order is an important and difficult notion in public space that relates quite strongly to this dialectics of crime, safety, and fear, which interplay quite complexly, especially in terms of the relationship between perception and reality. There's a wide variety of attempts at control over public space, attempting to produce different types of order, and these lead to more or less contestation or more or less collaboration or publicness, depending on the situations. One of the key aspects of public space theory is about the potential for civic action and protest. This is one of the most foundational public uses of public space that the literature often identifies. And then I think an interesting thing moving forward with public space theory is this idea of reciprocity, and thinking about how can we encourage these creative, collaborative interventions into public space and ways of using public space that go beyond serving our own individual or group interests, but also build into a wider public and inclusive way of using and understanding public space. Right to the City was a very useful analytical tool for me in terms of understanding this relationship between public space and justice. A lot of the constituent rights of the right to the city that are listed here, I found like critical markers of justice and publicness in space. And I just included a bit of Purcell's quote there because of this idea of scales of marginality. If we're talking about the most benefit to the least advantaged, who are really the least advantaged people in the society, and how do we balance their needs? I also kind of read, building on the sort of Marxist aspect of right to the city, I sort of understood this idea of prioritizing use value in urban space over exchange value as a way of reframing the entire understanding of urban space as public, and maybe using that as a different direction to think about the right to the city and the city itself. A few of the key issues that crop up in terms of the relationship with public space and right to the city, following on from those concepts. And just to note, I'm borrowing this picture is actually borrowed from Wendy's research site in Thohoyandou, but I think it gets a little bit at the issues of inequality and survival. Some of the South African public space theory suggests that we need our public spaces to facilitate survivalist activity, especially in terms of informal economies. But then again, as this picture shows, there's competition, there's issues of power, and access is not wholesale. So often these things seem to suggest trade-offs, and one of the questions I'm trying to push further into is, does it necessitate trade-offs to have a right to the city or to have spatial justice, or can we kind of have some sort of holistic approach there for holistic outcomes. I use the idea of encountering publics as an entry point into my methodological framework, and the picture on the right was kind of looking about these relationships between the self, other people, and how these kind of combine to produce the public or different publics. I grounded these frames with an autoethnographic approach by using myself as an entry point into the vastness, contingency, and in the words of De Soto, unlimited diversity of people's experiences and the ways they may interact. And the mix of different methods that you see listed on the left there was also about trying to understand the links between physical public spaces and kind of ideas of a broader public sphere, which Ash Amin has argued that these links are not generally strong. But I think perhaps in the local context, these links can and often are very strong. And when they're not strong, that's also something that's very important. This map kind of shows the location of the case studies and their connection with the walking route that I used, mostly along Rissock Street, from Gandhi Square in the south of the map, passing the City Council to Constitution Hill, and then down the hill again to Peter Ruas Park, and just a kilometer or two east of University of Witwatersrand, where a lot of us first met. And so Gandhi Square, I'll start by digging into a few of the issues around the space. I kind of ordered things according to a south to north thrust, which partly echoes the movement in the mornings from people's houses south of town through Gandhi Square and northwards into the city to places of employment. And that's why I've started here in Gandhi Square. I think it's a very interesting case in terms of interrogating what we mean by public-private partnerships. Privatization of public space is very strongly critiqued and criticized by one side of the public space literature, and it's seen as a great threat to the publicness of our spaces. And this relates to part of the right to the city that suggests people should be free from small group control. I think this is quite a critical issue when it comes to Gandhi Square, given that they actually have a lease over the space and quite a high degree of control over the uses and management thereof. That said, it does produce genuine public value in terms of the way it's highly used, it's very densely used, and also one of the safest parts of this area in town, which is a point of great value for many of the users. I think the whole branding of the square with the name of Gandhi and the statue, ostensibly as part of a move towards social cohesion in the square, it has instead prompted some bits and pieces of protest against Gandhi Square, especially since the discourse around his racism in his early years of time in South Africa came to light over the past 10 to 15 years. And so the statue has, as much as the reactions to it are generally muted, it's created as much disagreement and contestation as it has created cohesion. And I think that's another interesting dialectic of public space, is this thing of cohesion versus contestation, and whether those are entirely oppositional or whether contestation is actually part of the route towards cohesion. As a counterpoint to that, the queues, especially the queues for buses, are a place where I've seen the highest level of social integration in terms of some of the ways I think policy imagines social integration in public space, of conversations and relationships developing across age and class and color lines, just with the social lubricant of a queue for the bus. And I think these public values are quite important to reckon with, rather than wholesalely tossing out the entire space because it's privately controlled. I think it's the complexity of public and private space means that we do need to reckon with the public value as well. I've discussed a little bit about order and safety. I think the hugely desired and appreciated safety at Gandhi Square comes at some expense of exclusion because it is quite carefully policed and controlled. And some of the pictures below will demonstrate some of the aspects of that. This gives a sense of the operation of the square. This is actually during rush hour on Friday afternoon, which shows how spacious it is. Other than the queues, it's very spacious even at its busiest times. And the sort of threshold between semi-private spaces of businesses and restaurants spills out into the square in various ways. So those distinctions between public and private are quite blurred in some ways here. Here's just some tweets about the public debate around the figure of Gandhi Square. I mean, the figure of Gandhi in the square. I think it's quite fascinating to think about, and it's not really about whether or not Gandhi was a good person or not, but the fact that these kinds of figures can be contentious, and somebody suggesting that he got an iconic status through de Klerk and the National Party. And so these kind of complex public debates come out around these figures in very interesting ways, and can become important points of mobilization. In spite of its control, there is a level of public protest that's accommodated in the square. There aren't even more than one security guard that I can't picture in this picture. It was a protest outside one of the ANC regional branches in support of a regional leader. And I witnessed another protest against the Metro bus service in the square, which was mostly policed by the public police, interestingly. Toilets is a hugely important part of site-level spatial justice in public space, and unfortunately, central Johannesburg seems to have quite a poor record on this, and these toilets are extremely well used when they're unlocked at Gandhi Square, and unfortunately they are regularly locked, which creates a sort of site-level form of exclusion and undermines the publicness of the space, especially when you consider the fact that many people have to travel for hours before and after reaching the spot. So it is a really important public convenience in the space. And you can see here these spikes on these low verges to the bottom of the picture, sort of these defensive architectures that also produce exclusions. Moving on to Constitution Hill. It's a fascinating place that really presents the paradoxes of publicness. It blurs all sorts of different periods of history. It blurs public, semi-public, open and closed, private space. It blurs ideas of physical public space with the broader public sphere. Is a tense relationship between heritage and commerce that has undermined the development objectives of the precinct. And partly because of this very wide-ranging vision for the space, there's quite a lot of ambiguity produced in the ways that different types of people use and interact with the space. And I think this entranceway kind of encapsulates a few points of these paradox and ambiguity in terms of this several meter high door, which was designed to be imposing yet welcoming, which I think is a bit of an oxymoron perhaps. And they were very intentional in using glass for the court foyer to avoid it feeling cloistered and closed off, but then put these metal grills in front of the glass. So quite a few contradictory decisions in terms of how to reconcile openness and security. Despite the way that the precinct is quite carefully managed and controlled by private security, it's amazing the range of public work that takes place in the semi-closed public part of the precinct. For example, this People's Tribunal on Economic Crime, where people are doing amazing research and work into understanding corruption and fighting against it. Also noting that because of the way the precinct is managed, access to such types of events, while technically open to the public, is not even. It's also a place that accommodates a lot of important civic actions, and that's become a big part of the identity of the space, is protests and civic gatherings during or surrounding important court hearings or judgments. This was a celebration. The celebration started before the judgment was handed down and continued with a lot of people bringing cannabis plants, smoking cannabis in the square, and kind of appropriating it in some ways. But it's important to note that the way that the precinct is managed often precludes the organic unfolding of protest action in the way it's policed by both private and public police and the precinct managers. I think this picture gives quite a nice sense of how different user groups happen to get into the space for a variety of reasons, but that interaction between them is quite limited. And so here on the left, you have a group of students photographing the artworks and essentially going on a tour of the precinct to look at the art as part of their coursework. And on the right is a protest about the release of sorry, not the release, a protest against, I'll get into the detail of the protest if we have time later, because I will return to that protest. But I just thought it was fascinating how it's this critical site of civic action, but all the other people in the space kind of continue along with their days without even coming into any form of contact. And the same is quite true of the way tourists use the space as compared to locals, even though both groups of the people in this picture are local. Again, with toilets, on the top right is what used to be the public toilets in the square. They are now dilapidated and out of use and hidden away behind the ramparts in the fort. Now you must negotiate the unfriendly security at the court entrance and walk down this very long pathway to find a public toilet. And that type of difficulty and exclusion is also expressed by this locked tap, which could be a very useful amenity for survivalists in the area. To touch back onto some of the key development hamstrings, this field at the bottom of the precinct was always earmarked for community recreation facilities. And it seemed like in the negotiations in the 90s for the precinct, it was sort of stipulated that if you want to go ahead with this development, it's an essential component that you must provide these facilities for the dense populations of Hillbrow and Berea who have relatively low access to open space. And so the logo in the top right was, after in 2017, rebranded this fenced-off patch of grass as We the People Park. And unfortunately, it still remained fenced off throughout, and at some point was carefully renamed as We the People Park Event Space. And ever since then, it's only been used for the very expensive Afro-Punk Festival once a year. And we'll return to the implications of this for the local network of public space a little bit later. On the left, you have someone from the Afro-Punk Army, who is Afro-Punk's social justice army. That's part of the festival, is that they give back to the area in some way. But I think it also just speaks to the aesthetics, the way the space is designed. And it's in some ways an aesthetics of gentrification, removing these posters which are ubiquitous in Johannesburg and painting these beautiful murals on the outskirts of the precinct, which do make it very pretty and inviting, but it does in some ways seem to connect with this idea that the precinct is often managed more with a view to tourists rather than accommodating locals. And I have some recent anecdotal evidence that this is continuing quite strongly this year. Just a few hundred meters down the road is Peter Roos Park. Compared to the others, it's the only one that's sort of fully publicly owned and publicly managed. Although the difficulties faced by city parks and the agencies that they must collaborate with ultimately mean that the management in Peter Rose Park is what we might refer to as very light touch, as compared to, say, the flagship park in Region F, Rhodes Park, which now has very many park rangers and security dogs. Peter Rose Park and city parks cites a lack of resources, has never had park rangers. While this does in some ways undermine the security and safety of some users or potential users, it also allows a very mixed use and vibrant public feel to emerge in the park, at least at times. The fact that many illicit and illegal activities also continue in the park, as well as a fluctuating population of homeless people, bring up what I referred to as some sort of unnerving harmony. It's a well-used park by a wide variety of groups, but it's not an easy situation. And some of the more illicit or uncomfortable uses of the park for people have undermined their use of the park. And then in terms of looking at this kind of network of public spaces in the area, there was a gradual change during the period of my field work. Through 2018 and 2019, other public places in the inner city were either fenced off or homeless people were evicted from them. And this kind of continuously increased the population of Peter Rose Park until there was finally an eviction at the end of my field work. And as they themselves predicted, city parks, many of the people living there have since returned because they couldn't afford to install fences nor security guards. Here's a little map of the park. It's quite hilly, and so it's got a varied topography. There's a walled off canal in the south of the park. So there's quite a few different sort of zones within the park that get appropriated for different types of use. And I think these different zones are part of what allows this unnerving harmony to continue at certain moments. Here's just a picture of city parks handling the basic maintenance quite well, I think. But because of how many social issues manifest in these lightly managed public spaces, I think it's a bit beyond their grasp to really holistically deal with these issues and respond creatively as well as collaboratively with other parts of the city or other organizations. On the left here is a bench that was part of the JDA upgrade to the park a bit over 10 years ago. A lot of Parktown residents advocated for benches that would not allow sleeping on them. And JDA actually acceded to quite a few of the demands from the Residents Association in terms of trying to make the park more usable for them, reducing the number of ball games, for example. And a lot of this relates to the sort of historical grounding of the park, which was built at the edge of Parktown, despite its intention to serve the dense populations of Hillbrow and Berea. In the 60s, this was maybe more of a class issue, and Parktown residents tried to take a lot of ownership of the space. And then as the demographics have changed into the post-apartheid era, it has become quite racialized in terms of white Parktown residents being upset about the way the park is used by black football teams, for example. And I think the attempt at defensive architecture by building the benches like this was a little silly, given that people have been quite free to build shelters in the park that are much more useful and comfortable than sleeping on a concrete bench would have been anyway. Another sense of the sort of changing meanings of the park we can see here with this was a bandstand erected by the Parktown Association to celebrate 100 years of Parktown. And this is just over 20 years later, which signals the increased residential population of the park. This bandstand was previously used for a lot of political meetings, trade union meetings, part of the starting point for the numerous political gatherings and marches that either start or end in this park. Since late 2018 and into early 2019, it became appropriated for residential use and began to undermine other types of use. Along with the symbolism that has come into the park from the memorials erected by Parktown residents, it's also a sort of forum for public debate, as well as on the right warnings and sort of information deemed critical in the park. I'm not quite sure on the extent of human trafficking within this park, but I've shared this before and had some kind of glim nods of understanding from people. So it's the intensity of issues in the park is high, but it does produce a very mixed use and public feeling at times, and the wide range of activities and potential for civic activities has remained important. Just going to touch a little bit more on this process of eviction that I discussed. You can see at the bottom right, Port Plain Park, then Gandhi Square, which doesn't allow any public dwelling or homelessness, and Atwell Gardens, a public park slightly further north. Just outside Constitution Hill were some public toilets located just down the road from the Governor's House, which is an assessment center for homeless people to get help and to hopefully get placed into a shelter or to get some social assistance. So it's kind of a network of places that have been open to homeless people living there because of the light touch management. Other places like Conhill and Gandhi Square that entirely preclude that kind of behavior through private security, and then the sort of brutal evictions and fencing off of some places by government agencies, which is very complicated in terms of the spatial justice measure of benefiting the least advantaged people in society. People who are addicted to nyaope and people who are living in public spaces must surely be part of this group, but inner city children, such as those who are able to return to Atwell Gardens following the clearance of people using the space beforehand, also seems like a just act in terms of these children are desperately in need of a safe place to play after school ends in the day. So here's a picture of Port Plain Park and the difficult situation it was in before it got fenced off. The public toilets I mentioned, with people living in and around them, were renovated and fenced off, but then never opened for public use. So it's another instance where it perhaps could have created some justice as well as exacerbating injustice by displacing people. It's unfortunately remained unusable for a great deal of time since then. And I think this speaks quite directly both to the issues of siloed governance in city processes, but also speaks to some of the very real difficulties of management in harsh circumstances. Following the fencing off and clearance of those spaces just shown to you, you can see more shelters started popping up outside of the traditional spaces of residence in Peter Ruiz Park. So a shelter here on the left, the use of the bandstand and so on, that began to erode uses by children, by people gathering for meetings, and this created so many complaints to city parks that they eventually felt compelled to evict many of these residents in early 2019, noting that their upgrade to the park wouldn't really substantially alter any of the main patterns of use, and that they didn't have a plan of what to do with these people after they were evicted, or any plan of what to do should they return. And as I've pointed out, many of them since have. And that's just another picture. In terms of this route, this is a piece of Queen Street immediately below Constitution Hill, and at the intersection at the bottom of the street is where the first entrance to Peter Ruiz Park is. There's two primary schools along this stretch who don't like to let their learners go into Peter Ruiz Park at all. because of the concerns around safety. And of course, there's the We the People Park, which is fenced off, is just 50 meters behind us in this picture. So there's these two potentially amazing places for these children to spend their afternoons, and yet they spend each afternoon running around on this pavement and occasionally straying into this busy road, which is a very dangerous situation and unsuitable. I must note that since my research was completed, which showed a distinct lack of engagement with the park by surrounding institutions, in collaboration with some other NGOs, people from the Children's Memorial Institute just around the corner have started organizing a lot of exercise groups since the lockdown started for local children. And they actually had an open day event this past weekend where they collaborated with a whole range of local residents and other service providers to make this amazing open day in the park with a range of activities, and really trying to bring this kind of creative, collaborative approach to get the park to become more safer and usable by as wide a variety as possible. So it's happy.
5 minutes, Temba.
Okay, I'll wrap up quite shortly. This is the protest I mentioned, which started in Peter Rose Park and ended up going to the Constitutional Court. It's interesting because part of the content of the court case was about what we can consider appropriate and acceptable behavior during protest action. And at the same time as this is the issue of the court case, the way that the precinct was managed actually significantly altered the dynamics of this protest because they didn't let us into several of the entrances in Constitution Hill and forced us to walk all the way around the block. People were late, which then meant that they wanted to disallow people from entering the protest. And so it's quite fascinating just looking at the different levels at which public acceptable behavior is played out and negotiated and ultimately defined. So I'll just try and dwell for a couple of minutes on some of these concluding points. This idea of being beset by wider problems and then undermined by fragmented management is kind of looking at the core of the interaction between public space and spatial justice or injustice. I'm not sure if problems is necessarily the right word there, but it's looking at how the broader spatial injustices of the city necessarily impact individual and networks of public places. Some of the manifestations of these broader injustices are things like people living in public spaces that are relatively open, as discussed. Others include participating in protest, civic actions, or informal economies in public places. Various actors and stakeholders, both public and private, are involved in trying to address these allegedly improper and in some cases illegal use of public places. However, often management and policing of the case sites for this thesis do not address the root causes of these problems, and at times they repress emergent public uses. And in the words of Adegaya and Kutsia, this can produce outcomes that would have a negative effect on the already disadvantaged, which directly undermines spatial justice. I'll just return to one quick example from Peter Rose Park, whereby some of the longer established residents in the park make quite a significant contribution to safety and security in the park and surrounds. And by evicting them, you are repressing and breaking down emergent social movements that are beginning to articulate perhaps an element of Lefebvre's self-management as part of a pathway to a transformed urban future that he envisages with the right to the city. In other words, current understandings of public spaces mean that management thereof is not necessarily geared toward responding to spatial justice on a broad and structural level. So that relates to the point slightly below there about how public space and spatial injustice interact at both micro and macro level in terms of the location of taps and toilets and their availability, as well as these interactions between the broader spatial makeup of the city. I think one of the key arguments that came out of this was the importance of designing and understanding and of course managing public space more as a network rather than as a precinct or individual spaces, which has often been the case. The issue of private control and power needs to be quite carefully scrutinized. Private control of acceptable uses of public space implies a shifting of rights away from being a public good, which starts to alter the very meaning of what public means. This confirms the insidious potential of private control, as well as the importance of the state and civil society's regulatory role for ensuring publicness in privately managed, and I might add publicly managed spaces, especially because public sector management and design of public spaces can also produce exclusions, undermanagement, evictions, and issues relating to a lack of collaborative approach. And this relates to Carmona's point about how we should give much more focus to the design and management of public spaces and perhaps how these relate to use, rather than looking at ownership or models in determining publicness, because the correlation is not necessarily always strong. That said, in South Africa, where throughout much of our history, a lot of space has been very strictly controlled by disproportionately small groups, cannot be a simple acceptance of privatization and small group control. It is simply too dangerous in the context of continuing attempts to address the impacts of the park. I think I've just got one more minute to wrap up. I thought public culture was a very interesting idea because I think the way public cultures are developed kind of guides how people use and understand public space, at the same time as contestation over public space can reflect, shape, and ultimately manifest these public cultures. And this idea, as I've mentioned, between safety, contestation, social cohesion, and justice make measuring and concluding on these things quite complex. And signals the need for this type of site-level research on public space that has been raised by other researchers. Some of this paradox, as I alluded to earlier, is it's significant that the displacement of people framed as undesirable at times returns these spaces to other important societal uses. However, displacements also further marginalize already marginalized people, paradoxically raising the question of who counts as the most marginal in a city beset by poverty, unemployment, and spatial inequality. Given the trend of increasingly tight control over a growing number of central public places, the opportunity for appropriation and survival are increasingly limited. This denies the renewed right to urban life under the right to the city. I'll skip over this last point, comparing the places. The further I've gone in writing and thinking about the thesis and beyond has allowed some of the points of comparison of these spaces to sort of continue emerging as I think about it, which is quite an interesting thing in terms of some of the challenges of the thesis was about drawing a line and saying, this is enough, I can work with what I've got, and there's enough here to say something about it. Noting that there will be other opportunities for publication, engagement, and further research. Writing is, as I'm sure you'll all find, a huge part of the challenge. This idea of drawing the line and just saying, I'm going to stop with my field work now, I'm going to finish my first draft now, those kinds of things were very important to me. Finishing the document itself was much more difficult than I anticipated. That in itself took a lot of time, but once you draw a line and force yourself to get into that phase, it is very possible. And I guess as we've all been going through, it's kind of like going on a hike where each time you get to the top of the hill, there's another hill in sight. And the examination process felt a lot like that, having one examiner suggest that the thesis is great and should pass as it is, to the other extreme of another examiner requesting re-examination after a 10-page tirade into why it was simply not good enough. And then beyond that, more waiting for examination, waiting for feedback, and waiting for the bureaucracy and administration to finalize everything makes it feel like a long, drawn-out process. But from the other side, it just all feels possible. So that's my note of encouragement to end on. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Temba. That was very rich, and for me also listening to it, I'm hearing new things, or I'm paying attention to things I didn't notice while supervising, so I've really enjoyed your presentation. I think it's incredible having it condensed like this, and given that we don't have PhD defenses in our system, I really think this kind of opportunity is something we'd like to give to all 7 of the students in the cohort on this project. I just wanted to acknowledge that in the room we have had, I think, the 3 most significant women in this field, Prof. Karina Landman and Dr. Teresa Derseveit. Karina Landman from Pretoria University, Teresa Derseveit, a former colleague of us at Wits, but now at UNISA, and Ayanda Roji had to apologize for leaving early, but from City of Joburg, I think is really an incredible champion for public space and for these kind of dialogues with the city. So that is space that we are trying to embrace in CUBES as well going forward. Temba, with your help. Thanks very much. Yes, so I'd like to open up for discussion, questions, comments. Would people like to raise their hands? I see there's something in the chat. Oh, well done from Kira. I'm sure that resonates with across everybody. Who would like to start with comments and questions? So one thing, well, I see Simon has his hands up. I just wanted to say one thing that really came across very clearly for me was the scaled aspect, and how you were able to show how these things, how your conceptual engagement with questions of space and justice manifest at different scales, and how important that is ultimately for users, and therefore for the experience of spatial justice. Simon, can we have your question?
Thanks, Marie. I actually just wanted to ask Temba if he wouldn't mind. I know because he was probably rushing for time at the end that he probably skipped over the practicalities aspect of getting done. If you could just speak a little bit more about that, as I'm sure some of us, or especially me, are in that stage now, and any kind of feedback or tips or anything like that you could share.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, and thanks for your comment in the chat as well. I'm also looking forward to seeing where I go. I'll let you know if I find out. In terms of this thing of finishing the document and finishing the process, I think I'm hoping that this long, drawn out, difficult and unsatisfying experience of 2020 that I think has been quite common has been very good training for finishing a PhD. It does require a lot of patience and yeah, I think patience is an important aspect of that, and just kind of tell yourself that this is going to take quite a long time. The examination process, I guess, obviously will be different in everyone's cases depending on how the examiners receive it. And so I think that's just something you have to get into it and go for it as much as you can. I don't know, we'll see whether any of the supervisors jump in and disagree with me here, but I think at some point, this thing of drawing a line also has to apply to to how much you continue working into the thesis. And at some point you have to just stand your ground and say, I think I've now written up in a way that reflects my research nicely and reflects what I think about my research nicely, and then submit, because there's a very real possibility that your supervisors and examiners will also see things differently. So you might end up working into stuff that the supervisors think is crucial for you to improve, whereas the examiners might think that side of things was already sorted, but they'll pick up on a whole other side of it that you need to work on. So I think just setting oneself deadlines and saying, I'm going to finish my first draft, and that's going to be the first draft. And I'm going to finish this round of comments from the people I've got feedback from, and that's going to be that. I think I didn't get maybe enough help with proofreading, which made the last couple of weeks quite difficult. Also, personal things, things happen in our lives that also make those weeks of meeting deadlines quite difficult. So just hang in there, draw the line when you think the line needs to be drawn, and make sure you do set aside a fair bit of time for bringing the whole document together. I think I felt at some point like, okay, I'm done, I'm ready to submit, but to actually prepare everything for submission, to do all the page numbers, and then you have to change something, so the page numbers change, and then you must change the contents page again. There's a lot of those sort of little nitty-gritty things that just come up and require time and energy. So I think draw the line and push to finish, and then kind of get rid of that energy and bring in the patient energy, and get ready to wait and just kind of digest. So I guess that was a bit rambling. I hope some of it was useful, and I'll be happy to chat more and engage with all or any of you on that kind of stuff as you go through those processes.
Thanks so much, Temba. I'd like to ask Sarah and Monique perhaps to both give their questions, and then to have you comment on both of them. So yes, Sarah, over to you.
Hi, morning everybody. Morning, Temba, and I'm sorry I joined a bit late. I was coming from another meeting, but thanks so much for that really interesting presentation. My questions may be a bit sort of pragmatic and pedantic, but it's about the issue of public toilets that you referred to, and it's a particular bugbear of mine that so many so-called public toilets are just locked and unused, as you're pointing out with various of your examples. So I just wanted to hear your insights into what is so problematic about managing public toilets in public space, and what do you see as, I mean, from your research and from the inspiration you were drawing from the different ways in which people are using public space, what do you see as the kind of possibilities for really cracking that particular issue, finding new ways to manage and open public toilets?
Monique, do you want to follow with your question?
Sorry, I don't know if it's really a question. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to begin just by saying to both you, Marie, and to Temba, just like huge congratulations. It's really a really great dissertation.
Gerald, sorry, Gerald couldn't make it. He's in orals. I'm sorry.
But that's fine. They're just two things, Marie, that I think just in relation to Simon's question around where, around letting go and supervision that Temba raised. And I think it's something that we don't have to discuss now, but it is something that I think does need to be discussed amongst supervisors, perhaps, is when do you allow students to make the choices to submit something that you don't feel comfortable with, but at the end of the day, they own the dissertation. And I think it's something that, that is important to you know, to give that right to the students to do something that doesn't necessarily sit comfortably with us, or, you know, we're unsure about, but they feel more certain about. And often I think they're right. But the other one that the question that I wanted to pose to Temba is that what your dissertation shows very clearly, and I think it's really important, is the conflict that emerges between rights. Rights are not one absolute thing. And I think that's what takes you back almost into a Marxist view of understanding public spaces, because, you know, because we have to understand how contested those are. And I think the city as in government then becomes a mediator of rights, actually. In this, I suppose my question to you, Temba, is when we talk about our own positionality, we often speak about the optical stuff like race and gender and maybe sexuality. But I think the class embeddedness is a very difficult one to engage with, because strangely, being middle class, which is the case for, I think, most people who reach postgraduate studies, and of course for supervisors too, can either free you to taking a perspective which is more geared towards the marginal, and I can say that myself in the work that I do, but it can also do the opposite. It can also make you quite defensive of the rights of people that are, you know, permanent residents, that are paying ratepayers, whatever the case may be. So it could move either way. So I'm just wondering how you see yourself in relation to that and the conflict of rights.
Thank you.
Great questions. Thanks. Over to Temba.
Thank you very much for some very thought-provoking stuff. I'll maybe start in reverse, since that's freshest in my mind. I think you're right about how a lot of the positionality discussion centers around the identity markers more so than class embeddedness, which is perhaps a less shifting aspect of identity. And I think the question of scales of marginality in terms of how the city is composed links to this question quite a lot. And I think, for example, I think it's difficult to distinguish who is less advantaged between a group of Nyaope users and a group of children in the inner city. But I don't think it's difficult to distinguish between the marginality of a group of homeless people and a group of people that own flats in Parktown. So in that way, I find it relatively easier to position myself on that side, similar to how you describe yourself. And I guess that also links a bit to Simon's point about my future of my work and action in this field, and sort of starting to link up with people who are doing collaborative, creative interventions into the park, responding to the needs of inner city children and engaging and collaborating with park residents. And I see that as the sort of key starting point for this kind of discussion. And then again, as class is embedded in my life, and so even if I engage in that work, I will still most likely remain a middle class person. And so maybe the opportunity there is to sort of widen that collaboration, because middle classes where there's maybe more resources and those kind of creative collaborative initiatives that are starting up, they're often high on energy, but not that high on resources. And maybe connecting those two sorts of things is an interesting way of thinking about it going forward. But yeah, I think that the commensurability of rights is a really interesting discussion and quite a difficult one to get around. So nice to hear from you on that. I think just a quick note that came up when you mentioned the supervisor drawing a line, student ownership of the thesis thing. I think it is good as a student to say, I need to draw a line here. And it is good as a supervisor to also marshal that process, giving freedom to the student, but also noting that examiners, you know, might come down quite hard, especially as you say, if you're not comfortable on the work. And even though I had two very good examiner reports, the very bad one was, you know, it's quite hectic to receive that kind of feedback on your work, especially when it's a project of this nature that's gone on for years and you put so much into it, and then you get this thing that's like trashing it a bit. So I guess the supervisor's more well positioned to understand how the process is likely to unfold. So I guess that's the balance to the student making that decision as well. And thanks, Sarah. I think it is a huge issue. I think it's one of the most critical issues in public space, and I think it almost feels so simple, but in practice it seems like it's not. And I think it gets a little bit at the core of some of the paradoxes of public spaces. It's such a cross-cutting issue, so all of these various factors are making it difficult to design and manage public toilets in a way that's usable, because it's not enough resources to employ cleaning and security, or it's not enough resources to fix them if they get vandalized, or part of it is also societal governance. So the people who build the toilet might not be in charge of maintaining it, nor in touch with the people who might be using it. So those kinds of difficulties, because of the wide range of social issues that sort of necessarily manifest in public space, public toilets are prone to a lot of that. But I think the other side of this is that because it's a cross-cutting issue, if you can crack something like that, you can actually respond to a lot of stuff. And as much as I'm critical of precinct-based management, sometimes these precincts or spaces of safety, just a small safe zone can actually make quite a big difference. So if you can crack a public toilet and afford to employ a security guard, because I don't know, the vandalism and appropriation of those spaces seems to be at a high level. I'm not sure how to get around that. Maybe the architects can also chip in with more kind of cheap and durable designs, perhaps, which might assist that side of it. But if you can have toilets that have regular security and cleaning, you can actually provide more than just a toilet, and you can provide a small safe zone in a park, or a small safe zone, because it's going to be well used and there's going to be security. So that kind of, by facilitating that public activity in a sustainable way, you can actually enhance the publicness of that surrounding area, I think, as well.